November, 1703. London. The wind hits first. Then the water. Along the River Thames, a bridge that has stood for nearly 500 years begins to groan under a storm unlike anything the city has seen in living memory. Chimneys collapse. Roof tiles fly like knives through the dark. Ships are ripped from their moorings and hurled onto the riverbank as if they were toys. And underneath one of England's most iconic structures, something far more dangerous than wind is happening. The river itself is turning into a weapon. This is the story of a bridge that carried shops, homes, and thousands of lives above one of the busiest rivers in the world, a marvel of medieval engineering that became, quite literally, its own worst enemy. A flaw baked into its foundations from the very first stone. A flaw that nature eventually found, tested, and nearly broke. Welcome to History Harbor. Let's drop anchor on this one. A bridge unlike any other. To understand the flaw, you first have to understand what made this bridge so extraordinary in the first place. We're talking about Old London Bridge. Construction began in the 1170s, under the direction of a priest named Peter de Colchurch, and it was finally completed in the year 1209. King Henry II ordered its construction. King John saw it finished. For context, that means this bridge was already standing when the Magna Carta was signed. It watched the Wars of the Roses unfold. It stood through the reign of every Tudor monarch, every Stuart king, and it was still standing when candles were being replaced by gaslight. By the time it was finally torn down in the 1830s, it had lasted over 600 years, easily earning its reputation as the ancient bridge that refused to fall. But here's what made it truly unusual: this wasn't just a crossing. It was a neighborhood. Old London Bridge supported an entire street of houses and shops, stacked up to 7 stories high, leaning out over the water on both sides until they nearly touched in the middle, blocking out the sky. There was a chapel dedicated to Thomas Becket. There were bakeries, milliners, pin makers, and eventually one of the strangest buildings in England, a lavish, ornate structure called Nonsuch House, built entirely from prefabricated timber shipped over from Holland and assembled without a single nail. People were born on this bridge. They lived their entire lives on it. They died on it, sometimes never once setting foot on solid ground beneath its arches. And rising above the southern gatehouse, for centuries, visitors could see rows of spikes, each one holding the severed head of a traitor, tarred and preserved as a grim warning to anyone entering the city. Locals said you could smell the bridge before you could see it. It was crowded. It was chaotic. It was one of the wonders of England. And it was built on a flaw that nobody fully understood, not even the men who lived on top of it every single day. The flaw hidden in plain sight. Here's the problem. To hold up an entire town's worth of buildings, the bridge needed enormous stone piers driven into the riverbed. 19 of them, in fact, supporting 19 narrow arches across the Thames. But the piers themselves weren't slim, elegant columns. To protect them from the river's current and from ice, medieval builders surrounded each pier with a wooden, boat-shaped casing packed with rubble called a starling. Think of it as an armored shell wrapped around the base of every support. The starlings did their job protecting the piers. But they came at a cost nobody fully priced in at the time. Because as those starlings grew wider and wider over the centuries, repaired, reinforced, and built up again and again after storms and ice damage, they ate up more and more of the river's width. By some later estimates, the starlings and piers combined were swallowing up as much as 2/3 of the Thames' available channel at that point in the river. Picture squeezing a garden hose. The water doesn't just slow down, it speeds up violently through the narrow gap that's left. That's exactly what was happening under London Bridge, every single hour, every single tide. The Thames is a tidal river. Twice a day, the sea pushes water upstream, and twice a day, it drains back out. Under normal circumstances, that's a gentle, manageable rhythm. But forced through the narrow gaps between the starlings, the river became something else entirely, a raging, churning bottleneck. At certain points in the tide, the water level on one side of the bridge could sit several feet higher than the water level on the other side. Boatmen had a name for passing beneath it, shooting the bridge. And it was treated exactly like the phrase suggests, a dangerous stunt, not a routine crossing. Passengers were often told to get out and walk around on land while their empty boat was rowed through the gap by an experienced waterman alone, because so many people had died attempting to ride through. Boats capsized constantly. Some accounts describe dozens of drownings happening beneath the bridge's arches over the years, as the water roared through with the force of rapids. The very design that let the bridge carry an entire town above the river was the same design throttling the river below it. Nobody had engineered a flaw on purpose. It had been assembled, piece by piece, repair by repair, over centuries, until the bridge and the river were locked in a slow-motion battle that most Londoners simply accepted as normal. They even turned it into a spectacle. When brutal winters froze the slowed, backed-up water near the bridge, Londoners held frost fairs directly on the ice, full markets, bonfires, even elephants reportedly walked across the frozen Thames. It became a beloved tradition. Nobody realized the very thing making their festival possible was also quietly threatening to bring the whole bridge down. The storm that exposed everything. Which brings us back to that night in November, 1703. Later remembered as the Great Storm, it remains one of the most violent windstorms ever recorded in English history. Barometric pressure plunged to levels rarely seen before or since. Ships anchored in the Thames estuary were smashed against each other and driven ashore. Roofs across London were torn away entirely. Thousands of people across southern England lost their lives. And along the river, the storm didn't just batter the bridge from above with wind and debris, it attacked from below, too. Storm surges pushed enormous volumes of water up the tidal Thames, and all of that surging water had to force its way through the same narrow gaps between the same overgrown starlings that had been choking the river for generations. Contemporary accounts describe the water thundering beneath the bridge with terrifying force, throwing spray high enough to be felt by people standing on the structure itself. The bridge held. But it did not emerge unscathed. And more importantly, it did not emerge with its reputation as an unshakable wonder intact. The storm had done what centuries of quiet warnings from drowned watermen had failed to do. It exposed the underlying problem to an entire generation of engineers and city officials who could no longer treat the bridge's flaws as folklore or the price of doing business. The narrow arches, the swollen starlings, the artificial rapids, these weren't quirks anymore. They were structural liabilities capable of being tested by nature itself. In the decades that followed, calls to fix, widen, or entirely replace the bridge grew louder. Engineers pointed out that the very thing beloved about the bridge, the shops, the houses, the crowded skyline above the water, was also squeezing the river into a chokehold that no city could safely rely on forever. Eventually, some of the houses were removed to lighten the load and widen the roadway. But the deeper flaw, buried in the river itself, was much harder to undo. The end of an era. By the early 1800s, the verdict was unavoidable. London had outgrown its ancient bridge, and the bridge's own design was actively working against the modern city rising around it. Traffic jams stretched for hours as carts and carriages tried to squeeze across a roadway barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. And the river beneath it was still doing exactly what it had done for 600 years, roaring through impossibly narrow gaps twice a day with every tide. The solution wasn't another repair. It was a replacement. Engineer John Rennie designed a new bridge nearby, with wider, taller arches and none of the choking starlings that had defined, and endangered, its predecessor. Construction finished in 1831, and the new bridge finally let the Thames flow freely beneath it for the first time in over 6 centuries. The old bridge, the one that had carried a chapel, a palace-like house, a market street, and the heads of traders on its gatehouse for hundreds of years, was demolished shortly after. Its ancient stones scattered into private gardens and collections across England, souvenirs of a structure that had, remarkably, outlasted the Flaw at its own foundation for far longer than anyone had a right to expect. There's something quietly humbling about this story. Old London Bridge wasn't undone by ignorance. It was undone by success. Every repair, every widened starling, every reinforcement added to keep it standing for one more century, slowly built the very flaw that made it dangerous. It survived storms, fires, riots, and the passage of 600 years, not despite the choices that made it fragile, but often because of them, right up until nature finally showed everyone exactly where the cracks were. It's a reminder that the things we build to last forever are still shaped, slowly and invisibly, by the compromises we make along the way. Sometimes it takes a storm, a real one, to reveal what was there all along. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's most fascinating engineering stories, that's exactly what we do here on History Harbor, pulling back the tide on forgotten history, hidden flaws, and the stories behind the structures that shaped our world. If you liked this video, hit that like button, drop a comment with your favorite piece of hidden history, and subscribe with the notification bell so you don't miss the next voyage. Until next time, this has been History Harbor. Stay curious.